The Japanese internment camps of 1942 were the result of a fearful encounter between Japanese Americans and the American public due to World War II. The 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor intensified racism toward Japanese Americans, triggering popular support for their containment. The public's wish became true when President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced the internment of Japanese Americans, violating their civil rights of being treated fair and equal. The Japanese encountered such fierce discrimination following Pearl Harbor that there was a redress by the United States to compensate them for their unjust confinement in 1988. However, the country continues to struggle with discrimination towards groups of people, as seen by the reaction towards Muslims after 9/11. Anti-Japanese sentiment began with the arrival of the first wave of Japanese immigrants in 1886. Prior to their arrival, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 restricted the number of Chinese immigrants coming into the country, which limited the number of cheap laborers. From 1890 to 1924, Japanese men answered America's need for continuous cheap labor, but this frightened American laborers. Many Japanese proved to be skilled farmers by cultivating what white farmers saw as unusable land. Japanese immigrants encountered racism, not only from being viewed as outsiders, but because their success threatened white farmers. Before Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were assimilating into their new country's culture somewhat successfully, but not without obstacles. Despite discrimination in both legal and verbal terms, many immigrants came to lease prosperous farms and own businesses. They were not yet American citizens, nor able to own the land due to alien land laws throughout the 1900s, but they were still able to grow profitable crops. Without the majority of the public supporting them, they were still able to succeed. The bombing of Pearl Harbor inflamed anti-Japanese sentiment to a degree that it had never been before. Immediately after the tragic event, Japanese Americans were accused of spying and sending important information to Japan. It happened so fast that a 14-year-old Japanese American named Richard Babe Kurosawa, nicknamed after the famous baseball hero, was told by his close friend, "Hey Babe, you're an enemy now." As a result, many Japanese made the swift decision to burn all traces of their Japanese heritage as a sign of their loyalty to the United States. As much as the Japanese Americans denied that they were responsible for the bombing, no one believed them. The FBI investigated all persons of Japanese descent for the safety of the country, but did not come up with any evidence of betrayal. Nevertheless, this investigation did not affect the stance of the public. Pearl Harbor created a dramatic shift in perspective about Japanese Americans, causing an unwanted and unexpected encounter which further deepened animosity toward the Japanese. Although Japanese Americans unceasingly tried to prove their loyalty to the United States, it was not enough to satisfy the public's hostility. The public demanded retribution for Pearl Harbor and pushed for FDR to separate the so-called traitors from the innocent. His cabinet disagreed, believing that interning the Japanese was unconstitutional and unnecessary. Hesitant at first, President Franklin Roosevelt eventually signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, which forced all Japanese Americans west of the Sierra Nevada mountains into internment camps. Once Executive Order 9066 was signed, there were mixed feelings of fear, confusion, and surprise amongst Japanese Americans. Even though they were aware of the nation's view about them, they did not anticipate government intervention, especially at this degree. Almost immediately, the public began to see the executive order as an excuse to treat Japanese Americans unfairly. The public began to treat Japanese Americans of their money by offering to buy expensive items for half of their value, or threatening to take it for free once they were gone. They had no choice. Japanese businesses went on sale, and farmers ended up selling their tractors for only $50 of the $500 they were worth. The exchange between the public and Japanese Americans was uneasily tense. Clearly, Japanese Americans had begun to suffer from the impact of the perspective-changing encounter. The internees were forced to live a highly minimal lifestyle with the inadequate conditions of the camps. The poor conditions were in part due to the hot, dusty, desert-like location, but also because there was an urgency to move Japanese Americans into the camps. The buildings that the Japanese Americans had to live in were poorly made since they rushed workers to each make an average of 20 buildings a day. The internment camps held around 10,000 people. The government no longer recognized Japanese Americans by name. They were rather identified by a combination of numbers found on a tag they were given. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences, along with armed guard towers, which they were told was for their protection. 6-year-old Amy Iwasaki Mass pointed out that if the guards were protecting them, why were their guns facing towards the inside of the camps instead of out? In the camps, Japanese Americans were treated as convicts instead of American citizens. They were allowed to work for pay, but were given less than prisoner wage. They received only meager meals and rare visitor opportunities. The Japanese American internees were undoubtedly prisoners of their own country. In confusion, an interned 6-year-old boy declared, "Mommy, let's go back to America." However, all the internees were finally released after 3 years, with the suspension of the executive order in 1945 by President Roosevelt. When the Japanese American internees returned home, they had to start over again. All signs of their life before internment camps had vanished. Many internees suffered from social amnesia, which repressed their memories, causing them to not speak about their internment camp experience. In fact, the Nisei, the second generation of Japanese Americans who tended to be born in America, were known as the Silent Generation. Inspired by the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, the Sansei, the third generation, finally demanded a redress by the government in the 1970s. In 1976, President Gerald R. Ford became the first president to acknowledge the United States' violation of Japanese American civil rights and officially repealed the executive order. Then, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, which provided a formal apology and compensation of $20,000.
So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice.
Many Japanese Americans deeply appreciated that the government recognized their wrongdoing, but nothing would ever be able to erase their experience and feelings of what they considered their imprisonment. It is truly undeniable that Pearl Harbor created a tragic encounter that changed Japanese American lives forever. The attacks on America on September 11, 2001 are tragic events similar to Pearl Harbor that still affect the United States today. 9/11 influenced America's view about Muslims in Muslim-dominated countries by associating Islam with terrorism. The fear produced by these attacks resulted in a perspective-changing encounter, which dramatically changed the view of Muslims in America, similar to how Japanese Americans were viewed after Pearl Harbor. As seen throughout history, these types of encounters can lead to terrible presumptions and the alienation of one culture. In an effort to help our country resolve the discrimination of Japanese Americans, President Roosevelt proclaimed, "Americanism is a matter of mind and heart. Americanism is not, and never was, a matter of race or ancestry." Japanese internment camps are an important part of America's history that should not be forgotten. A dramatic change in perspective of Japanese immigrants caused the creation of internment camps in both thought and deed. Not only were Japanese Americans discriminated against before Pearl Harbor, but they became the victims of prejudice after the attack. It was unfair and unreasonable that Japanese Americans had to suffer from the repercussions of Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese words "Nidoto Nayoni" state, "Let it not happen again."